It seems that public school and schooling in general has always been the way education is done. This is certainly what appears to be the case in our lifetimes, but it isn't the truth. I'd like to dispel the myth that homeschooling is alternative education. Until the 1860s, homeschooling was just about the only way anyone ever received a lower school education. Today, its track record is better than any other form of education. Homeschooler test scores are higher as a group than both public and private school test scores. The numbers of people homeschooling is growing exponentially. But homeschooling always worked as a way to educate. The list of remarkably accomplished homeschoolers throughout history fills our history books. Some of those who received all or part of their education as homeschoolers include writers, poets, composers, and artists like Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the Little House on the Prairie series, Agatha Christie, who basically invented the murder mystery, Robert Frost, who made the America's Greatest Poet, C.S. Lewis, Mozart, Beethoven, Irving Berlin, who wrote God Bless America and White Christmas, John Philip Sousa, Felix Mendelssohn, who wrote that wedding march you hear every time you go to a wedding, Frank Lloyd Wright, America's Greatest Architect, Andrew Wyeth, one of America's great painters, Ansel Adams, America's greatest photographer, Leonardo da Vinci, Claude Monet, who invented the Impressionist School of Art, Charles Dickens, and Mark Twain. Inventors and scientists who homeschooled include Alexander Graham Bell, whose mother homeschooled him before he invented the telephone. The Wright brothers, who invented the airplane. Thomas Edison, who invented electric light, film, the recording of music, and countless other inventions. Ben Franklin, who gave us the stove, and bifocals, which I wish I had a pair of now, and electricity. Botanist and inventor George Washington Carver, Florence Nightingale, who founded modern nursing, and Albert Einstein, our greatest physicist. Athletes who homeschooled include Blake Griffin, who's with the Clippers and had a really good night a couple of nights ago. Michelle Kwan, Venus and Serena Williams, the greatest female tennis players in history. Tim Tebow, who's an NFL quarterback. And Joey Logano, the youngest driver to ever win a NASCAR race. Stars and singers who homeschooled include Charlie Chaplin, who virtually invented the film industry, Taylor Swift, Whoopi Goldberg, Kristen Stewart, Leanne Rimes, Elijah Wood, who played Frodo, Justin Timberlake, Demi Lovato, Ryan Gosling, Alan Alda, and the first great jazz artist, Louis Armstrong. Businessmen who homeschool include Andrew Carnegie, Joseph Pulitzer of the Pulitzer Prize, and Colonel Sanders. So next time you get chicken at Kentucky Fried Chicken, remember it was made by a homeschooler. Leaders and presidents who homeschooled include Ben Franklin again, because he did everything, Winston Churchill, Albert Schweitzer, Sandra Day O'Connor, the very first female Supreme Court Justice, Alexander Hamilton, who gave us our monetary system, Daniel Webster, Susan B. Anthony, and Condoleezza Rice. Military leaders who homeschooled include General Douglas MacArthur, General George C. Patton, General Robert E. Lee, and Admiral Matthew Perry. And presidents who homeschooled include George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, that's our first 7 presidents, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James Polk, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, James Garfield, Grover Cleveland, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Barack Obama for several years. That's 18 of our presidents who homeschool. Millions of people in the United States homeschool today, anywhere from almost 2 million to 6 million, depending on whose numbers you believe. As of 2007, the numbers came to roughly 3% of all the children being educated in the United States, and the numbers of homeschoolers has gone way up in the last few years. Now, why is this success story being kept so quiet? When people talk about homeschoolers, they often have an image in their mind of bizarre, silent, strange kids and families practicing peculiar religious rites in lieu of education. And while there doubtless are pockets of aberrant behavior around these lines, overall, Homeschooling is the education success story of our time. So why doesn't everyone homeschool? Well, homeschool is seen by many people to be a very hard thing to do.
Lies.
I'm sorry?
I said lies.
I'm getting there. Hang in there. You're right. After all, it's harder. It's harder to take full responsibility for a child's education than to just get up early and drop your kid off at school or at a bus. It requires a far higher level of involvement and commitment to your child. You're responsible for their entire education as a homeschooler, from when they study, to how they study, to what they study, and to the results achieved. A homeschooling parent needs to determine what curriculum to use, if any, and what they want their children exposed to, both as an educator and as a parent. You'll have to spend time making sure your student learns something, and you'll probably administer some tests, I'll get to it, or some sort of evaluation. So, are you a trained teacher? And what do you know about teaching anyway? And don't you have a life of your own, a job, bills to pay, and not a lot of time? You are paying taxes, some of that money goes to pay for public schools. Why shouldn't you use them? Your children cannot possibly receive the proper degree of socialization if you homeschool. Why, everyone knows that. And you'll be spending far more time with your kids than many parents want to, or that your kids want you to spend with them. I would argue that all of these issues are reasons you should homeschool. I'd like to take them point by point and demonstrate how they are strengths and not liabilities. Is homeschooling harder than dropping off a kid at a school every day? You bet. Is it harder than catching a bus? Yes. It's harder, and you're going to be spending a lot of time with your kids. So why have children in the first place? Was it really to entrust their futures to others? Or was it to participate in another person's life? To perhaps help shape it and to be there when the light in their eyes wakens with interest and with understanding? I was personally shocked at how quickly the years went by for my kids. They're now 22 and 26 years old. My daughter's getting married next year, and my son has been a professional actor for 6 years. After educating them throughout their entire childhood, I wish I'd had more time with them, not less. Perhaps your child is difficult. Well, that's a blessing. Difficult children have often grown up to be the prickly, difficult adults who change the world. So long as they don't have the difficult in them tested and evaluated and graded away. I'll bet John Adams and Ben Franklin were really difficult children, unlikely to just agree to anything. And is there any doubt that Thomas Edison probably disassembled every single family artifact and put it back together again? Think how crazy he drove his parents. Did Mozart ever stop humming melodies as a child while studying history or whatever? Every child is special, every child is unique, and I think that every child is difficult. Raising a child is work, and a lot of it, regardless of how you educate them. There is no child who does not present a series of daunting challenges to his parents and his educators. That's one way we know that that child is alive, aware of the world around him, and growing in his influence over the world. And why would we want it any other way? Now about dropping your kids off at school. I used to hate doing that when my kids were going to private schools before we started homeschooling. That was one reason I taught at their schools. At least if I got up early, there was a reason to do it. Getting up early to drop your kids off somewhere ends the day you decide to homeschool. In this regard, homeschool families clearly have it easier. Homeschoolers determine their own schedule, including what school hours they're going to use. Not all students work well in the morning. You can tailor your hours to your students' strengths. And if you're working out of your house, you don't need to go anywhere. School can start at 10 a.m. It can start at 1 p.m. If you're a working parent, as most of us are, you can start school at 5 p.m. when you get home. And what if you're not around to help your child with his studies? Well, I strongly recommend the forming of homeschool groups of multiple families working together. I'll cover that in a few minutes. But what I've seen with hundreds of homeschoolers I've worked with and had others tell me about is that most homeschool children develop self-sufficiency as they get just a little bit older and experienced. This is not always the case, but it usually is. Parents often write to tell me that their children get excited about their homeschool studies and start their work before mom and dad get up in the morning, or insist on working on a lesson plan at night before going to bed. I've seen homeschool kids as young as 10 almost entirely run their own studies, including my own son, for months at a time. This does not absolve a parent or homeschool educator from doing their share of the educating work for their children, but it is a comfort to know that your young man or woman will learn to work on their own and learn to want their education and work for it. And it happens all the time with homeschoolers. It's what often happens when a person is left free to take responsibility for their own future, as you've heard other speakers talking about today. There are children who do absolutely need more discipline than that at first. But by degree, once experienced, freedom is an addiction and it usually grows. Children who homeschool often come to understand rather quickly that the more responsibility they take for their own education, the more they're going to get out of it. It's a perk of child-directed education. Of course, this all works best when the least amount of critique is offered the child. Eliminating grading, testing for punitive or grading purposes, and critique of the student's creative efforts frees the student to take ever-increasing responsibility for their work, and that means leaving behind almost the entire methodology standardly used by schools today. Homeschoolers can do this. It's a strength found in homeschooling, and the wise homeschool educator makes a crusade of it. A non-critical approach to education is safer for the child. It invites his or her participation without fear of reprisals, or correction, or grades, or evaluation, or helpful suggestions. It invites the child to spread his wings and see just how much he can create without fear or reprisals. Isn't the purpose of education to allow each child to experience the best in them, their most creative and vital ideas and skills? Wouldn't it be best for civilization at large if each of us experienced to our depths our best and most creative instincts? Homeschool can do this, and do it well, and do it consistently, avoiding the critical approach to education that is currently institutionally mandated. Then there's the question of what to study. The child has to study something. Henry David Thoreau was one of America's great unschoolers. He would take his class of Concord children into the local fields to dissect and admire the flora and the fauna, and the world became the lesson. That was his curriculum. But we are not all as skilled or as educated as Thoreau. As a homeschool mom or dad, you no longer have the supposed advantage of the school district and state's approved curriculum and all of the direction that it provides. You will most likely need to decide what your child is going to study. Though many homeschoolers do use their school district's curriculum and simply do it at home, most homeschoolers do not, and out of choice. As homeschoolers, so far, though they're trying to change this now, we are not generally obligated by law to adhere to government standards like Common Core. We are not obligated to follow any standards at all. Standards local, national, imposed by school boards, politicians, or teachers who do not know the first thing about our child. As a matter of fact, we are free to determine exactly what and how our children will study. This is in accord with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a United Nations document, agreed upon by almost every country on earth, including the United States in 1949. Article 26 of the Universal Declaration states, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. You'll note this document that the United States agreed to uphold does not say that the state shall have the prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given children. Parents have the right, the prior right, above the state. Accordingly, anytime the state instructs someone that they do not have the right to decide what their child will and will not study, or even how or where they'll study, they are in violation of this international agreement to which the United States is a signatory. As a parent, you can always elect to adhere to state mandates as to your child and his education. But you are also entirely within your rights to ignore those mandates. You are the person empowered to decide how your child will be educated and what they will study. It is your right, it is your responsibility. And this allows you one of homeschooling's signature advantages, to tailor your child's education around their interests and their strengths. As homeschoolers, you do not need to place certain subjects at the core of your studies, as the state mandates and schools must do. President Bush stated clearly that math and science would be the focus of all future school curriculum. Well, math and science are not the entire world, though they're important subjects. And for many, many students, math and science are not their future. They certainly were not for me or my children. These subjects are not where many students want to go or need to go. They are not where the student is headed in life. And it is the student's life we're concerned with in education, not the school's life or its mandates. America's greatest historian, Will Durant, stated that civilization moves forward through the creativity and the efforts of inspired individuals pursuing their ambitions. Our own founding fathers, our greatest inventors, many of our most important leaders homeschooled, and in so doing, received an education focused on their interests and their ambitions. If this were not so, the United States would probably not be here today. An education that is largely determined by the student and his or her needs and strengths and interests and dreams is much more likely to give us the result of an adult employed precisely in the area in which they are called. Work and create with far more joy than those whose cookie-cutter education limits their options, pushing them away from any personal, unique ambition which they might have cherished while young. Edison's, Lincoln's, Washington's, and Mozart's do not happen by accident. They are self-created by being allowed to pursue their own interests, and their education was tailored accordingly. A classroom is not an environment where education can individually be constructed or tailored. There's too many students, even in a classroom as few as 15 students. In larger classroom situations, often the teacher doesn't even know the name of his students without a seating chart. Believe me, I was one of those teachers. I knew some of my kids' names, and not all of them, until I gave up that stuff. So how could that teacher possibly know the first thing about any of their students' individual unique potential or their interests? They cannot know. They do not know. But mom and dad know. We see our children in far more personal and intimate terms. So when Junior takes an interest in something not taught in school and wants to invest his energies there, we're free as homeschoolers to allow that to happen, to encourage it, even at the expense of standard studies. In that way, we move away from the cookie-cutter mentality of schooling and become instrumental in building individuals engaged in activities they love. And such children love their education because it belongs to them and not to a school or a government. Yes. So how about that idea that you can't teach mom and dad? Well, you've heard often enough, I imagine, that complete nonsensical idea that parents unless they have a degree in education, are not qualified to teach. I've been teaching 40 years. I didn't spend one day in college. And I taught at USC and Cal State Northridge and a bunch of universities. So even though you see your kid with far greater clarity and have a far greater interest in them than any teacher or school, you are not qualified. But teachers almost always have their degrees in education, not in a specialized area of study, particularly at the elementary school level. They often know nothing about the subjects they're somewhat arbitrarily assigned to teach. When I was teaching in a high school for Los Angeles Unified, I saw many teachers reading their textbooks one chapter ahead of the kids. They didn't have any expertise in the subject. They didn't know it. Such teachers are no more qualified than anyone to teach subjects in which they possess no practical or working knowledge. What a teaching degree tells us is that person is a trained teacher and knows how to use the standardized tools of institutional education. Tools such as testing, grading, student assessments, classroom teaching, the application of national standards like Common Core. We also know that these tools have failed millions upon millions of students. The dropout rates in large cities often exceeds 40%, and in some unfortunate districts, 50%. And those are the numbers that high schools and districts announce. They don't tell you about the kids who drop out before the last year. Well, a company that built cars of which 50% did not work and then informed you that you were legally obligated to buy their cars, run them out of town. Even graduates today, even from college, are all too often unprepared for the real world of the marketplace. The unemployment and underemployment numbers for such graduates are readily available and very, very depressing. Whatever is happening in most schools is not working and has not worked for a very long time. A typical classroom and teacher apparently can't complete a day's work in a day. Hence, your child will receive hours of homework. This has a lot of unhappy results, including occupying the parents' time as well as the kids. And it prevents a child from having any time to discover his own interests and passions and pursue them. When a child has a special need, the school can't do a whole lot or bend a bunch or change its institutional mandate to accommodate that need, even with the best of will. And I'm not saying there aren't teachers who want to do that. There are. They can't. Not in a school environment. But the homeschool experience can and is tailored around the child's needs. Oh, and then there's that other old hacksaw about your child is behind in his education. Behind what? Certainly not behind himself. Each of us learns as fast and as well as we learn. So what is the child behind? Some mythical average he or she was supposed to attain by a certain time in a certain subject. Well, who determined the average? And no one is average. Every child is unique. There is no average. So what is the child really behind? They're behind some government or district or school mandate created by people who do not know your child's name, do not have a clue what interests your child have, and who have no plan other than the most general, meant to service tens of thousands of students at a time, all in the same manner. There's a problem with that. Education happens one at a time. One student at a time, one fact at a time, one realization, one hands-on experience, one set of eyes growing wide with understanding, one at a time. And homeschooling allows that bottom line truth to serve as its beacon and its guide. So Mom and Dad, I propose that as a teacher you could not possibly do a worse job than most schools. Even the best teachers generally give grades and tests to evaluate a student. You can start throwing all that away. Given your intimate awareness of your child, you have the chance to do a better job than even the finest teacher. What's more, you do not need to work alone. I'm a huge fan of homeschool groups, 2 to 5 families sharing resources, energy, expertise to get their kids through a student-oriented educational experience. With 3, 4, 5 adults, each bringing their experience and expertise to the table, the students are likely to receive whatever it is they need in assistance. And those parents know other people with expertise they can share as well. If no parent in the group is good at algebra, Uncle Bob will be. Additionally, this approach allows a particular parent to isolate the days and hours when they're going to need to participate. The duties are shared. If properly coordinated, perhaps a given parent will need to work twice a week with the students for 4 hours at a shot. We set it up this way. That's 8 hours a week dedicated to educating your child. And that leaves plenty of time for jobs and other priorities. There's also help in the form of prepared curriculum if such help is ever deemed to be needed. A lot of people need it, a lot of people don't. There's tons of homeschool curriculum available out there, more than there has ever been, to do a lot of the teaching that needs to occur. A lot of it is designed to be student-directed. The course teaches the subject, the student follows and connects the dots. Such studies come in books, downloads, live sites, live webinars, interactive courses online, all kinds of shapes and sizes. The homeschool parent will always have some work to do, though. There will be times when a lot is required of a homeschool parent. Parents may be required to issue tests and score them and make certain that review occurs as needed. But testing should be kept to a minimum and should never be grade-oriented or punitive. It should have nothing to do with grades. It should only focus on discovering what the student did and did not understand in his studies, so that a targeted review can be done of the materials they didn't quite get. I authored a curriculum for my own kids, and it works that way. This limits the parent's exposure as a teacher if they don't feel comfortable doing it, and I found a lot of other curriculum that works that way as well. The help you need to teach successfully is out there, and you are free as a homeschooler to use it. So we come to that final liability in homeschooling. We're told that homeschooled children do not experience a thing called socialization. We are so informed by teachers and administrators and a few other folks who may mean well and may not. Socialization was a concept developed by a man named Cooley, who experimented using his own children. In the early 1900s, Cooley was a teacher of economics and sociology at the University of Michigan. Don't forget the economics part. Mr. Cooley had many interesting ideas. He believed in a class or caste system. He believed that corporations growing at the time needed a compliant class of workers and of buyers. He felt that each class would contribute something different to society. This is much like the old and rotten system in India, in which each caste has its own unique assignment, from the philosophical life of the Brahmin to the working life of the untouchable. This is a system that many social reformers like Gandhi despised and worked very hard to change. The acceptance of one's place in the world and one's inherited work was an important part of Cooley's view of life. To quote Mr. Cooley directly, "How is a man to find where he belongs in life? The more original he is, the less likely he is to find his place prepared for him." So, don't be original. That's his suggestion. Instead, find the place prepared for you. There is no free will or freedom of decision in Cooley's universe. Your life is decided not by you, not even by God, but by the circumstances of your birth. So spake Cooley. Socialization was his answer to individuality. He decided there should not be any. What is socialization the way we speak of it today? It is the idea that people must spend time in their youth around many others and learn how to get along and go along. But many of the people who made our civilization did not get along well with others. Not at all. If Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and those other great homeschoolers got along, there would be no United States of America. If men like Edison and Lincoln simply accepted the world as it was and got along, this world would be a far darker and grimmer place than it is. Again, there's Will Durant and that idea that it's the inspired individual who's doing something unique, something others can't or do not understand, that makes progress happen. This is true in every human endeavor, even in religion. Martin Luther and a few others didn't get along, and hence we have virtually every Christian faith except Catholicism. Buddha didn't get along, or he would have remained a Hindu and we would have never have had Buddhism. Moses certainly didn't get along when he insisted Pharaoh let his people go. Jesus didn't get along either, given the incident in the temple. I guess those poor souls were not properly socialized. My wife had recently passed away when I started homeschooling my own kids. My son was 9, my daughter 13. They'd gone to private schools where I taught their whole lives, so I could be near them and participate in their education. I admit, I was afraid, pulling them from school, that they would miss their friends too much and that they would not be socialized properly. The fact that they'd each experienced abuse in their schools, a fact that is all too commonly experienced by school kids, was not foremost in my mind. But I didn't want them to be lonely. So I showed my curriculum to a few friends who happened to be teachers. They pulled their kids from school, and we had an instant homeschool group with 10 kids and 3 parents sharing responsibilities. The group expanded over the next few years, and my kids were surrounded by their friends every single day. So much for being isolated. My kids and I also did one little exercise a few times. At lunch, we went to the local Carl's Jr., and we sat in the back and we watched public school kids come in to eat. As a group, and with exceptions, of course, they were largely violent and antisocial. Just as I would be today, if forced to be in a place for many hours every day, told I had no freedom to determine my own future, my movements, my interests. Just as I would be in a place where I knew there was a fair chance each day that I'd be harassed or abused in some way, as I was in public school when I attended as a child. We have another word that describes such places. We call them prisons. How many homes need metal detectors at the front door? Almost every school needs them today. Almost any child studying at home surrounded by friends and family is far safer than a child in a school, a child surrounded by strangers, passing judgments, and perhaps looking for an opening to abuse the child. And there's no question that many schools have a huge abuse problem. Anyone who claims this isn't so is either willfully ignorant or dishonest. So here's my answer to socialization. Forget it. It's a lie. In speaking to a lot of college administrators over the last 5 years, I've been told they are now actively recruiting homeschoolers for their schools for 2 reasons. 1, homeschoolers are academically advanced as a group, a fact borne out by tons of tests. And 2, homeschool kids are better socialized, more able to cope with and deal with people as a group and in a work environment than their public school counterparts. Even universities have finished and figured this one out. All right, I want to sum it up. Here are the advantages of homeschooling. Studies are tailored around the student's needs and interests rather than cookie cut. A student can and will learn at their own pace. There's no one left behind because there's no such thing as behind. There's no pressure and there's no homework. This leaves time for the student to experience his own life and discover his own interests and calling. The family can participate in creating an educational program and have input. The student is in a comparatively safe environment every day. The student will be educated by people who know and love him, who understand his shortcomings and strengths, and will know how to work with them or be willing and able to put in the time to figure it out. The hours are flexible, they can be organized around the student and the family's needs, Education can continue unhindered even when traveling or moving, or if the child happens to work, as in the case of my son, who was a professional actor at 16. The costs are almost nothing. I knew one family that homeschooled their daughter through her last 4 years of her education, and they did not spend one dime. The public libraries fulfilled almost all their material needs. Homeschool groups are easy to form. There are no legal organizational needs to be put in place in most states. A homeschool group spreads the burden, provides resources, as well as handling social needs. Academically, homeschoolers score higher as a group in testing than other forms of education. So, in spite of what you may have heard, homeschoolers are actually receiving better educations. Major colleges and universities throughout the country actively now recruit homeschoolers. So if you wish, your homeschooler can most certainly go to college. Will you be spending more time with your child if you homeschool? Yes. That is the very best perk of homeschooling. Thank you for your time. And homeschooling